My dad started acting strange after retirement, and then I found out he had a secret family. And in that instant, as I stood in the dim glow of his old study, the world I built my entire understanding of family on cracked open like a fault line under my feet. The kind that swallows houses whole in those earthquake documentaries we used to watch together on lazy Sunday afternoons when I was a kid, and he was still the unshakable hero who fixed bikes and coached Little League without ever missing a game. It started innocently enough, or at least that's how I rationalize it now. Looking back through the haze of disbelief, Dad had retired 6 months ago after 35 years at the engineering firm, the one where he'd climbed from draftsman to senior project manager, always coming home with stories of blueprints and deadlines that made Mom roll her eyes over dinner. But lately, since handing in his notice and collecting that gold watch at the awkward office party where everyone clapped too long, he'd been distant, not the relaxed retiree we'd all imagined, puttering in the garden or finally tackling that stack of unread novels on his nightstand. But instead, slipping out for unexplained errands that stretched from morning coffee runs into late afternoons. His phone buzzing with texts he dismissed as spam from old colleagues, his eyes darting away when I'd ask about his day during our weekly check-in calls. The ones I'd insisted on after moving 2 hours away to the suburbs with my own job in marketing and a house that needed constant fixing, just like the one I grew up in. I remember thinking it was depression, maybe, or that quiet midlife unraveling. You've read about in articles shared on social media, the ones with titles like How to Spot Retirement Blues in Your Parents, so I'd suggested golf lessons or a community center class on woodworking. But he brushed it off with a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes, saying he was fine, just adjusting, and Mom had echoed that, her voice thin over the phone, as she described how he'd taken to long walks alone, coming back with that faraway look, like he was mentally tallying something I couldn't see. But then came the day I decided to surprise them, driving down unannounced on a rainy Friday after work, the wipers slapping rhythmically against the windshield as I navigated the familiar highway, thinking I'd help with the garage cleanout they'd been putting off, maybe order pizza and binge that new series on Netflix about dysfunctional families. Ironic now, in hindsight, and when I let myself in with my spare key, the house smelled of fresh coffee and something sweeter, like vanilla candles Mom never burned, and she was at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop with red-rimmed eyes, not noticing me at first, until I said her name, and she jumped, closing the screen too quickly. But not before I glimpsed what looked like a bank statement littered with unfamiliar charges. Hotels in the next town over, restaurants we'd never been to as a family. Even a jewelry store receipt from last Christmas when he'd given her that simple necklace she'd worn without question. What's going on? I asked, my voice steady, but my stomach twisting, as she tried to wave it away, saying it was nothing, just bills, but her hands shook as she poured me coffee, the mug clinking against the saucer. And that's when Dad walked in from the back door, rain dripping from his coat, his face paling when he saw me, like I'd caught him mid-theft. And in that moment, the air thickened with unspoken accusations, the kind that hang in suburban kitchens where secrets aren't supposed to live, amid the granite countertops and stainless steel appliances we'd helped them pick out during the remodel 5 years ago. I didn't plan to snoop, not really, but after an awkward lunch where conversation stalled over sandwiches, and Dad kept checking his watch, claiming he had a doctor's appointment he couldn't miss, though his last physical was months ago, and he looked healthier than ever. I found myself wandering into his study while he was upstairs changing. The room still cluttered with his work files he'd promised to sort, and there, on his desk, half buried under a pile of mail, was an envelope with a handwritten address. Not in Mom's neat script, but something curlier, more feminine, and curiosity, that traitor, made me open it, my heart pounding, as if I were the one hiding something, and inside was a photo, a glossy 4x6 of Dad, smiling broader than I'd seen in years. His arm around a woman, maybe 10 years younger than Mom, with 2 kids, a boy about 12, gap-toothed, and grinning, and a girl, maybe 8, clutching a stuffed bear, and on the back, in that same curly handwriting, "Miss you, Daddy. Come home soon. Love, Mia, and Jake." The words blurred as bile rose in my throat, and I flipped through the envelope's contents, finding more. Birthday cards, addressed to our favorite grandpa. Wait, no. These said Dad, and receipts for tuition at a private school 40 miles away. Utility bills for an apartment I'd never heard of, all in his name, but with a different address. And suddenly, the strange absences made horrifying sense. The golf trips that left no tan lines, the old friend visits that coincided with school holidays. The way he started using a second phone he called his burner, for spam calls, but now it screamed affair, no, worse, a whole parallel life, a secret family tucked away like a hidden savings account, nurtured, while our own family trudged through the everyday grind of orthodontist appointments and parent-teacher conferences he'd attended dutifully, or so I thought. I don't remember walking downstairs, but suddenly I was in the living room, thrusting the photo at Mom, who crumpled like tissue paper, tears streaming as she whispered, I suspected, but I didn't want to know. And Dad, coming down the stairs, froze midway, his face draining of color. And for the first time in my 32 years, I saw him as fragile, not the rock solid father who taught me to drive in the old station wagon or held me through nightmares after Grandma died, but a man capable of this betrayal, this duplication of love that cheapened everything we'd shared. How long? I demanded, my voice cracking, the photo trembling in my hand, and he sank onto the couch, head in hands, muttering, 20 years, but it's not what you think, which only ignited the fury in my chest. Because what else could it be but exactly that? A wife. No, a mistress turned mother to his other children, hidden in plain sight, while Mom raised me alone through his business trips, the ones that now reeked of deception, the ones that now reeked of deception. And I paced the room, rain lashing the windows like accusations, my mind reeling through memories tainted now. The Christmases where he'd seemed distracted, the anniversaries he'd forgotten until the last minute, the way he'd always had cash for extras, but claimed budgets were tight. Mom sobbed quietly, clutching a throw pillow like a shield, and I wanted to comfort her, but my own grief choked me, this raw, Barrett's, lure, gaping wound of realizing my father wasn't who I'd idolized, that his love was divisible, portioned out to strangers who called him Dad too, and as he tried to explain, something about a one-night stand that grew into more, a mistake he couldn't abandon, I cut him off, shouting that mistakes don't last. 2 decades don't build families on lies. And the pain sharpened with every word, guilt flickering in, because maybe I should have noticed sooner, should have questioned the inconsistencies, instead of chalking them up to aging or stress. But mostly anger, hot and unyielding, at him for shattering our family just as retirement should have brought peace. We sat there for hours, the confrontation unraveling in fits and starts. Him admitting the woman, Sarah, had been a colleague once, the affair starting during a project in another state, and when she got pregnant, he couldn't walk away, so he compartmentalized, sending money, visiting when he could, fabricating alibis that Mom had swallowed out of trust or denial, and now, with retirement, he'd been spending more time there. Hence the strangeness, the pull between two worlds finally tearing him apart. By evening, as the rain eased to a drizzle, I felt hollowed out. The immediate fallout settling like dust after an explosion. Mom retreating to the guest room, refusing to share their bed. Me driving home in a daze, ignoring his calls. The photo burned into my mind. Wondering how to protect my own life from this ripple, how to face work Monday, pretending normalcy, when everything felt irrevocably broken. The trust I'd placed in family evaporating like morning fog, leaving only the stark, painful truth that my dad had lived a double life, and I, his first child, was now collateral damage in the wreckage. That first full night after the discovery stretched into something unrecognizable, the kind of darkness that presses in from every corner of the house I'd grown up in, now foreign, every creak of the floorboard sounding like accusations, every shadow on the wall, reminding me of the photo still clutched in my hand when I finally left around 11, driving the 2 hours back to my own quiet suburban street with the radio off, because even music felt like an intrusion on the raw pulse and hurt that had taken up permanent residence behind my ribs. I let myself into my house, our house, though Mark was away on a work conference, until Sunday, and the silence greeted me like an old friend who didn't know what to say, so I flicked on the kitchen light, made coffee I didn't drink, stared at the half-empty dishwasher from breakfast that morning when everything still felt ordinary, and then the dam broke again, silent at first. Just tears sliding hot down my cheeks as I sank to the floor with my back against the cabinets, knees drawn up, the photo now creased and damp in my fist. Those two children's faces staring up at me with innocent smiles that made my stomach twist because they hadn't asked for any of this, hadn't chosen to be the secret half-siblings I never knew I had. I thought about calling Mark, waking him in whatever hotel room he was in, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you explain over a crackling phone line that the father you've always described as steady, reliable, the man who walked me down the aisle at our wedding with tears in his eyes, had been living a second life for longer than we'd even been together? Instead, I texted Mom a simple, I'm home safe, and she replied almost instantly with 3 dots that hovered forever before disappearing. No message following, which hurt more than silence because it meant she was trying to find words and couldn't. The same way I couldn't find any to describe the betrayal that felt less like a single wound and more like every memory of childhood had been quietly rewritten in invisible ink, only now visible under this terrible black light. Around 2 in the morning, when sleep refused to come even after I'd taken a long shower that left my skin red and raw, my phone lit up with Dad's name, and I let it ring until voicemail picked up, then it rang again and again, until finally I answered. My voice, flat and unrecognizable even to myself. He didn't say hello, just started talking in that low started, measured way he used when explaining complicated schematics at work, saying he'd driven to the apartment after I left, that Sarah was asleep now with the kids, that he'd sat in the parking lot for an hour, trying to decide whether to come home or stay, and I hated how clinical it sounded. Like he was reporting on a project delay rather than confessing he'd maintained two households, two sets of bedtime stories, two Thanksgivings where someone always got the smaller slice of pie. I never meant for you to find out like this, he said. And I laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed in the empty kitchen. You never meant for me to find out at all. I shot back, and he didn't deny it. Just breathed heavily into the phone until I asked the question that had been clawing at me since the study. Did he love Mom less because of them, or us less because of her? There was a long pause, the kind that stretches across decades, and when he finally spoke, his voice cracked. I love your mother. I always have. But I made choices I can't undo, and every day since Jake was born, I've been trying to balance something that was never meant to balance. Jake? Hearing the name out loud made it real in a way the photo had it. The boy had a name, a life, soccer practice, probably, favorite cereals, nightmares he ran to Dad about. The same Dad who used to check under my bed for monsters with a flashlight and a serious face. I asked about the timeline again, needing to map the damage, and he told me in halting pieces. Sarah was 25 when they met on that out of state assignment, a junior engineer fresh out of grad school, bright and ambitious. It was supposed to be one conference, one mistake. It was supposed to be one conference, one mistake, but then the pregnancy test came back positive, and panic set in, followed by a strange, stubborn sense of responsibility that grew into something he called love, but I could only hear as cowardice. He'd rented the apartment first as a temporary solution, then bought it when the guilt became too heavy to carry without a place to put it down. Paid for everything quietly through a separate account. Mom never knew about because he handled the finances. Always had. A trust I now saw as the perfect cover. Your mother deserved better, he said. And for the first time that night, I heard real grief in his voice. Not the defensive explanation, but something broken. And part of me wanted to reach through the phone and comfort him the way I used to when he lost a big contract or when his own father passed, but the larger part recoiled because comforting him felt like forgiving him, and forgiveness was a country I wasn't even close to visiting yet. We talked until the sky outside started to lighten gray and reluctant, and by the end my throat was sore, my eyes swollen, and he asked if he could come see me tomorrow, if we could sit down, face to face. But I told him no, not yet, maybe not ever, because seeing him would mean seeing the man who'd lied to my face for 20 years while hugging me goodnight, and I wasn't ready to reconcile those two versions. After we hung up, I sat on the couch with the lights off, watching the neighborhood wake up slowly. Mr. Henderson, walking his labradoodle, the delivery truck idling at the corner. It's kids waiting for the school bus in hoodies against the early spring chill, and felt an overwhelming loneliness, not just for the family I thought I had, but for the version of myself who believed in unbreakable things. Mark texted around 7 that he'd landed and was heading home early because he could tell from my one-word replies something was wrong. And when he walked through the door, an hour later, in KUS, dropping his suitcase and pulling me into his arms without asking questions, first, I finally let myself sob against his shoulder, the kind of ugly, gasping, crying that leaves you empty afterward. I told him everything in fragments between breaths, showed him the photo on my phone, watched his face go from confusion to shock to quiet fury on my behalf. And when I finished, he didn't offer platitudes or promises that it would be okay, just held me tighter and said, we'll figure out what comes next together, which was the only thing that felt solid in that moment. We spent the rest of the day in a strange, muted routine, ordering Thai, takeout we barely ate, scrolling Netflix without choosing anything, him making more coffee while I stared out the window at the rain that had started again, soft and steady like it was trying to wash the whole ugly truth away. Mom called once, her voice small, asking if I was okay. And I lied and said yes because telling her the truth, that I was shattered and furious and grieving all at once, would only make her feel worse, and she'd already carried enough. Dad texted good morning, and then nothing else, respecting the boundary I'd set, or maybe just too exhausted to push. And as night fell again, I lay in bed beside Mark, our hands linked under the covers, listening to the rain tap against the roof, wondering how many more nights like this we'd have before the pieces started fitting back together in some new, scarred shape, or if they ever would. The confession had come, raw and incomplete, but the real work, the slow, painful excavation of trust, was only just beginning, and in the quiet dark, I felt the first faint flicker of something beyond rage. Not hope yet, but the recognition that surviving this would require more strength than any of us had shown so far, and that scared me almost as much as the secret itself. The days after that sleepless night blurred into a careful choreography of protection. The way you move around broken glass and bare feet, every step deliberate, so the sharpest pieces don't find skin. And the sharpest piece right then was my 10-year-old niece. Lily, my brother Tom's daughter, who still believed her grandfather, was the man who showed up at every soccer game with a thermos of hot chocolate and a goofy sign that read, Go Lily Go, in glitter marker he'd borrowed from her craft box, I couldn't let the truth reach her yet. Not when she was already navigating the confusion of her parents' divorce settlement. The one where Tom and his ex traded weekends like trading cards, and Lily learned to pack 2 backpacks, one for each house with labels so nothing got lost between homes. Mom and I agreed without needing to say it aloud. We would shield the kids, Lily first, then my own future children, if Mark and I ever got that far, because whatever damage Dad had done to us, we refused to let it cascade downward, like runoff after a storm. So when Mom called me Monday morning, her voice steadier than I expected, asking if I could come over after work to help her sort through the mail that had piled up while she'd been too stunned to open anything, I said yes, but only if we kept it quiet. No raised voices, no tears, in front of the neighbors, who might drop by with casseroles they always seemed to have ready for any crisis. I arrived just as the school bus dropped Lily off at the corner. She waved at me with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet learned that adults could fracture, ran up the driveway in her purple rain boots splashing through puddles, and hugged me so hard my ribs ached, asking if Grandpa was feeling better because Grandma said he had a bad cold, and that's why he hadn't come to her last game. The lie sat in my throat like a stone, but I managed to smile, ruffle her hair, tell her he'd be back on the sidelines soon, cheering louder than anyone. And she believed me because children believe the people they love want to protect them from monsters, not become one. Inside, but Mom had set out coffee and a plate of store-bought cookies we both ignored. We sat at the kitchen island, the same spot where I'd done homework while she chopped vegetables for dinner. And she slid a legal pad toward me with a list written in her careful cursive: joint accounts, retirement funds, life insurance beneficiaries, and beneficiaries. The practical bones of a marriage that had lasted 38 years until it hadn't. We talked in low voices about freezing the second account he'd used for Sarah and the children, about consulting a lawyer, not to divorce yet, she insisted, not ready for that word, but to understand what was legally hers, what could be protected before he had a chance to move more money. Every so often, she'd pause, stare at the fridge where a photo of all of us at the beach last summer, still hung by a magnet, shaped like a crab, Dad's arm around her shoulders. And I'd see the grief settle deeper into the lines around her eyes, but she never cried in front of me that afternoon. Instead, she straightened her spine and asked practical questions about how to change passwords on their shared email, how to monitor credit reports for new accounts he might open. Small acts of reclaiming control that felt like building a sandbag wall against a flood already in motion. When Lily came in from playing outside, cheeks flushed from the cold, asking for a snack. Mom switched seamlessly into grandmother mode: apple slices with peanut butter, a glass of milk, questions about spelling homework, and I marveled at how she could compartmentalize pain the way Dad once did, though hers came from necessity rather than deception. After Lily retreated to the living room to watch cartoons, Mom turned to me and said the words I'd been dreading: I need to talk to him tonight. Alone. I wanted to argue, to say it was too soon, that she should wait until the anger dulled enough to keep her safe from saying things she couldn't take back. But I saw the resolve in her face. The same look she'd worn when she went back to community college at 40 to finish her nursing degree while raising me, refusing to let life stall out. So I left before dinner, hugging Lily extra long, promising to take her to the mall that weekend for new sneakers, anything to keep normalcy stitched together, even if the threads were fraying underneath. That evening, Dad called me, his third attempt since the confrontation, and this time I answered. But, sitting in my car in the grocery store parking lot, because I couldn't bring myself to go inside and pretend to care about cereal brands. He sounded smaller, older, so he'd spent the day at a hotel because Mom had asked him to leave the house for a few days, that he understood why, that he was trying to give her space. Then he asked a question that cracked something open in me again. How's Lily? Not how's your mother, not how are you, but Lily, the grandchild he'd spoiled with ice cream cones and piggyback rides. And I realized with a fresh stab of pain that even in his wreckage he still cared about the next generation, that the love wasn't fake, just divided, and that made it hurt worse because it wasn't a clean villain story where I could hate him without reservation. I told him she was fine, that we were keeping her out of it, and he exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. Thank you, he whispered. And for the first time I heard shame instead of defensiveness, a raw acknowledgement that his choices had endangered the one thing we all agreed was sacred. We didn't talk long. I wasn't ready for more details, more excuses, but I did set the first real boundary. No contact with Lily until Mom and I decided otherwise. No surprise visits to her games. No texts with emojis of soccer balls. He agreed without argument, voice thick. And when we hung up, I sat there watching rain streak the windshield, feeling the tiniest shift. Not forgiveness, not even understanding, but the recognition that protecting the innocent parts of our family might be the only thing left we could all still do together, even if from opposite sides of a widening chasm. Later that night, Mom texted me a single line. We talked. He's staying at the hotel. I'm okay. And I knew the painful conversations had only just started. The slow, low, halting negotiations over what could be salvaged from the ruins, what boundaries needed, drawing in permanent marker. But for the first time since finding that photo, I felt a faint, fragile sense of agency. Like maybe we weren't just victims of his secret, but people capable of deciding, day by day, how much of him we were still willing to let in. By the following weekend, the house felt too small for all the unsaid things still hanging in the air like humidity after rain. Every room carrying the faint echo of conversations Mom and Dad had tried to have in the days since he moved into the hotel. Short, clipped exchanges about logistics, mostly. Who would pick up the dry cleaning, whether to cancel the cable package they'd shared for 20 years, never quite reaching the deeper fracture, because neither could bear to name it fully, yet without shattering completely. I needed distance, not just from him, but from the suffocating familiarity of the place where I once felt safest. So when Mark suggested I take the weekend to visit my college friend Jenna in the city, 2 states over, I booked the train ticket before I could second guess myself, telling Mom I had a work thing that required FaceTime. A half truth she accepted without pressing because she understood the need to breathe somewhere. The betrayal wasn't painted on every wall. The train ride gave me 6 hours of gray landscape sliding past. Towns I didn't recognize, blurring together, time enough to replay every moment since the discovery without interruption. No phones ringing, no Lily's bright voice asking innocent questions. Just me and the low hum of the tracks, and the slow realization that anger, while protective, was starting to exhaust me, leaving behind a quieter grief that felt more dangerous because it invited questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. What parts of my childhood had been real? What love had been genuine? Whether I could ever look at family photos again without scanning for signs I'd missed. Jenna met me at the station with her usual no nonsense hug, the kind that squeezes the air out of your lungs and reminds you some people still see you whole. And we drove straight to her apartment overlooking the river, the one she'd moved into after her own divorce 5 years earlier, a place full of plants she talked to and books she actually read instead of stacking for show. Over takeout Thai, pad C, ew for me, green curry for her. We sat on her balcony, wrapped in blankets against the March chill, and for the first time I let the story spill without editing for anyone else's feelings. The photo, the second family, the 20 years of careful lies, the way Dad's voice had cracked when he said Lily's name on the phone, like she was still his to protect. Jenna listened without interrupting, refilling my wine glass when it got low, and when I finally ran out of words, she said simply, "He doesn't get to decide how much pain you carry. That's yours to portion out." We talked late into the night about boundaries, not the angry kind I'd thrown at him on the phone, but the deliberate, calm ones that might actually hold. Transparency about finances, no more surprise contact with the kids in our family until trust could be rebuilt brick by brick if it ever could access the records of the other household only if Mom needed it for legal reasons. And most importantly, love. No expectation that forgiveness would arrive on his timeline. She pulled out a legal pad, same brand Mom had used, and we made actual rules, writing them down like a contract with myself. I would not pretend everything was fine for Lily's sake if it meant gaslighting my own reality. I would check in with Mom daily, but not become her sole emotional support. I would allow Dad one text per week, updating his availability for family matters. Nothing personal, nothing apologetic until he showed change instead of just saying the words. Putting it on paper felt strangely powerful, like drawing lines in the sand that the tide couldn't immediately erase. And by the time we finished the bottle, Jenna had convinced me to email a family therapist she'd seen after her split. Someone who specialized in adult children of long-term infidelity, not to fix Dad, but to help me untangle the knots he'd left in my sense of self. Saturday morning, we walked the river path, coffee in hand, rain spitting lightly enough that we didn't turn back, and I told her about the guilt that kept surfacing. Not just for Mom, but for those other children who had grown up thinking their father's absences were normal, who probably had their own version of grandpa's on a work trip again, and how part of me hated them for existing, while another part ached for them, because they hadn't chosen this either. Jenna didn't rush to absolve me of the contradiction. She just said, "You can feel more than one thing at once. That's not disloyalty, that's being human." The weekend passed in small, deliberate acts of reclaiming space, sleeping in without guilt, browsing bookstores without a mental checklist of people to buy for, eating dinner at a tiny Italian place where the waiter remembered Jenna's usual and brought extra bread without asking. And by Sunday afternoon on the train home, I felt the first faint loosening in my chest. Not relief, exactly, but the knowledge that I could step away and still exist, that the family fracture didn't have to swallow my entire identity. When I got back, Mark was waiting with dinner in the oven, roast chicken, the one recipe he'd mastered after we married, and he didn't bombard me with questions, just kissed my forehead and asked if I wanted to talk or watch mindless television first. We chose television. Curled on the couch with my legs over his lap, and halfway through the second episode of some cooking competition, I paused it and told him about the rules Jenna and I had drafted, showed him the photo on my phone of the notepad page, the bullet points, neat and unyielding. He read them slowly, nodding, then said, "These are fair. We'll stick to them. And if he pushes, we push back together." That night, I slept better than I had since the discovery. Not dreamless, but without the frantic waking every hour to check my phone for messages I didn't want to read. Monday morning, I forwarded the therapist's contact to Mom with a short note. No pressure, but she might help sort through the noise. And copied Dad on a separate email with the boundaries listed plainly. No greeting, no signature, just the facts. Weekly check ins only. No unscheduled visits. Financial transparency required before any further discussion of reconciliation. His reply came hours later, brief. Understood. Thank you for being clear. No pleading, no excuses. Just acceptance. And in that small surrender, I glimpsed the possibility. Distant. Fragile, that he might actually respect the space we needed, that the man who'd hidden so much for so long could learn, slowly, to stop hiding and start showing up honestly, even if it meant facing the consequences alone for a while. The weekend away hadn't erased the hurt, hadn't rebuilt what was broken, but it had given me the scaffolding to stand on while the real reconstruction began. One careful boundary at a time, and for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where cautious hope wasn't betrayal of the pain, but a necessary companion to it. The email from the therapist arrived in my inbox 3 days after I forwarded her contact to Mom, a simple confirmation that she had an opening for individual sessions starting the following week, virtual or in person. Her tone professional yet warm in the way people trained in listening. Managed to sound even in 12-point fonts, and I booked the first slot for myself before the courage could leak away, telling Mark over breakfast that Friday that I was going to talk to someone, not because I was falling apart, exactly, but because the pieces inside me felt like they were rattling around, loose. And I needed someone neutral to help me figure out which ones still fit and which ones I could finally set down. He nodded, poured me more coffee without comment, squeezed my shoulder on his way to the garage for his commute, and that small, ordinary gesture, his hand lingering just long enough, made the decision feel less like surrender and more like the first deliberate step towards something resembling steadiness. The first session was on a Tuesday evening. Rain tapping against my office window at home while I sat in the spare bedroom. We'd turned into a makeshift workspace. Laptop angled so the camera caught only me, and the neutral beige wall behind. No family photos in frame because even the happy ones felt tainted now. Dr. Ellis, mid-50s, silver streaked hair pulled back, calm eyes that didn't flinch when I launched straight into the story without preamble, listened for the full 50 minutes, almost without interrupting, only nodding occasionally, jotting a note here and there, and when I finally wound down, throat hoarse from talking more continuously than I had since the discovery, she asked one quiet question. What part of this hurts the most when you picture it? I expected to say the lie itself, the 20 years of Sunday dinners where he smiled across the table at Mom, while carrying another woman's children in his mind. But the words that came out surprised me, that he still loves them, that he didn't just walk away when it got complicated, that there's enough of him for two families. But I keep wondering if that means there was never quite enough for ours. She didn't rush to reassure me that wasn't true. Instead, she reflected it back gently. It sounds like you're grieving, not just the secret, but the idea that love might be finite, and his choices make you question whether yours was ever the priority. And something inside me unclenched a fraction. The way a muscle you didn't know was clenched. Finally releases after years of holding. We ended with small homework. Each day, write down one memory of Dad that still felt unequivocally good. No qualifiers, no second guessing the context, just the feeling it carried. Then, and another sentence about what I needed from any future relationship with him, even if that future was only polite distance. The exercise sounded simple, almost childish, but that first night I sat at the kitchen table after Mark went to bed and managed 3 lines. The summer he taught me to parallel park in the empty mall lot at dusk, laughing when I hit the curb again and again, but never once getting impatient. The way he'd read me, The Hobbit with different voices for every character, until I fell asleep against his shoulder. And then, haltingly, that I needed him to show, not tell, that the man in those memories could still exist alongside the one who'd built a second life. That consistency mattered more than grand apologies right now. Mom started her own sessions the next week, separate from mine, and we compared notes in careful text rather than long calls. Both of us wary of leaning too hard on each other when we were both still learning to stand upright. She said Dr. Patel, different therapists, recommended by a colleague at the hospital. Had her journaling too, but hers focused on anger, what it felt like in her body, where it lived, tight jaw, shallow breaths, a low burn behind her sternum, and what small actions eased it even momentarily, walking the neighborhood loop at dusk, Listening to old jazz records Dad used to play when they were first married, chopping vegetables with deliberate slowness. She told me once, almost shyly, that she cried through an entire session, not the dramatic sobs of the first week, but steady, quiet tears, and afterward felt lighter, like she'd finally allowed herself to mourn the marriage she thought she had instead of the one that actually existed. We didn't talk about Dad much in those early weeks, not directly. It was more about rebuilding the ground under our own feet, learning to trust our perceptions again, after years of accepting his version of reality without question. Small vulnerability crept in anyway, unbidden. I texted him one Thursday evening after a particularly hard session where Dr. Ellis had asked me to imagine what forgiveness might look like, not as absolution, but as a choice to stop carrying the weight of his shame. And the only thing that came was the truth that I missed the version of him who used to call just to ask how my day went. No agenda, no guilt lurking underneath. So I sent him a single line. I miss talking to you about ordinary things, and left it there, no follow up, no demand for explanation. He replied the next morning. I miss that too, more than you know. No emojis. No long paragraph of remorse, just those 6 words. And for the first time since finding the photo, I didn't feel immediate rage at the sight of his name on my screen. Instead, there was a cautious curiosity, like testing a frozen lake with one toe to see if it would hold. We didn't text again for another week, but when he sent a photo of the hotel coffee maker with the caption, "Still can't make it as good as yours," I answered with a picture of my own mug, steam rising, and wrote back, "Practice more." It wasn't reconciliation, wasn't even close, but it was contact that didn't feel like walking into a minefield, a tiny bridge, built of everyday tales rather than big emotions. Mom noticed the shift too. She mentioned over Sunday brunch, just the two of us at the diner near her house, Lily with Tom that weekend, that she'd started leaving voicemails for Dad again. Short ones about practicalities at first. The furnace filter needed changing. The neighbor's dog kept digging under the fence. Then, one evening, she'd added, almost as an afterthought, "The azaleas are blooming early this year." He'd called back the next day to say he'd noticed them too when he drove by to drop off the mail, and they talked for 7 minutes about gardening. Nothing deeper, but long enough that she didn't hang up feeling hollow afterward. These were the small acts, fragile as new shoots after frost. A text about coffee, a comment on flowers, a memory written down without resentment attached. They didn't erase the hurt. Some days the anger still flared hot when I pictured Sarah and the children, when I wondered what birthdays he'd missed of mine to attend theirs, but they created space around the pain. Room to breathe, while the deeper work continued in those quiet therapy hours. By the end of the month, I could sit with the photo on my phone without my pulse spiking immediately. I could think about Jake and Mia without the automatic twist of jealousy, could even acknowledge that their existence didn't cancel mine, though accepting that intellectually was still miles from feeling it in my bones. The tentative contacts with Dad remained minimal, supervised by the boundaries we'd set, but each small exchange felt like testing the water temperature before diving in, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to believe that the water might not be as cold as I'd feared, that there could be a path forward where we didn't have to pretend the past hadn't happened, but where we could still share a future made of ordinary, honest moments instead of secrets. The first joint session felt less like therapy and more like stepping onto a frozen pond in early spring. Every movement calculated to test whether the ice would hold or send us plunging into the dark water below. And I arrived 10 minutes early to the neutral conference room downtown because sitting in the parking lot with the engine running and the heater blasting felt safer than walking inside alone. Doctor Ellis had suggested we try one in person meeting after 6 weeks of individual virtual calls, framing it as a chance to practice being in the same physical space without the buffer of screens. And Mom had agreed first, saying she wanted to see his face when he spoke, instead of imagining it through a voice on speakerphone, while I'd hesitated longer. Was I, Bird, hesitated longer, worried that proximity might reignite the fury I'd only recently learned to bank rather than let burn unchecked. Dad was already there when I pushed through the heavy glass door, sitting on the far end of the L-shaped couch in a navy sweater I recognized from years ago, the one Mom had bought him for his 60th birthday, hands folded in his lap like he was trying not to take up too much space. He looked up when I entered, eyes meeting mine for a brief second before dropping again, and the silence stretched until Mom arrived, coat still damp from the drizzle outside. Her steps deliberate as she chose the armchair opposite him, rather than the spot beside me on the love seat. Dr. Ellis started gently, no icebreakers about the weather or how traffic had been, just a quiet invitation. Let's begin with what each of you hopes might come from today, even if it's small. Mom spoke first, voice low but steady, saying she hoped to understand. Not excuse, not forgive yet, but understand. Why the secrecy had felt safer to him than honesty, because the not knowing had left her second guessing every memory, every quiet evening they'd shared on the porch swing with lemonade and fireflies. Dad listened without interrupting, jaw tight, And when it was his turn, he exhaled slowly, like releasing air he'd been holding for months, and said he hoped to name the deeper thing that had kept him silent so long: fear, not just of losing us, but of facing the man he'd become. The one who could justify building two lives because admitting he'd failed at monogamy felt worse than living the lie. I stayed quiet longer than I meant to. The words stuck, somewhere between my chest and my throat, until Dr. Ellis turned to me with that calm, expectant look, and I finally managed. I want to stop feeling like I have to choose between hating you and missing you. I want to know if the dad who taught me to ride a bike without training wheels can still exist without the shadow of everything else. The room held the words for a long moment, no one rushing to fill the space, and then Dad looked directly at me. Really looked, not the quick glance of guilt, and said, "He does. He's still here. But he's also the man who made choices that hurt the people he loves most, and I am trying to own both parts instead of hiding one." It wasn't an apology, exactly. Not the scripted one I'd imagined in angry fantasies, but it carried weight because it named the split inside him, without asking us to stitch it closed on his behalf. From there, the conversation moved in halting circles. Not linear progress, but the slow turning over of stones to see what lived underneath. He admitted the affair hadn't started as love, but as escape. Pressure at work. Oh, the thrill of being seen as capable and desirable again, after years of routine. And how that initial spark had hardened into obligation when Sarah told him she was pregnant. How he had convinced himself that supporting two families quietly was better than blowing everything apart. Mom asked about specific moments. The weekend, he had claimed food poisoning so he could attend Jake's first birthday instead of our traditional Labor Day barbecue. The Christmas he had left early for a last minute client emergency to make it to their holiday dinner, and with each revelation her face tightened. But she didn't cry or leave. She just nodded once, absorbing. Then asked what he felt in those moments, not what he told himself afterward. He answered honestly, voice rough. Shame so thick, it made his chest ache. Relief when he walked through their door and saw the children run to him. Terror that one day the compartments would collapse, and he'd lose everyone. I listened, surprised to find the anger didn't surge as fiercely as before. Instead, there was a weary recognition that his choices hadn't been made in a vacuum. That weakness and fear and selfishness had tangled together over decades. And while that didn't absolve him, it did make the story less cartoonishly evil and more tragically human. Dr. Ellis guided us towards smaller, present tense steps. Could we agree on one thing we each needed right now to feel safe continuing these conversations? Mom said transparency. No more hidden accounts. Access to statements if she asked. No contact with Sarah or the children without full disclosure to us first. Dad agreed immediately, then added his own request. Patience not endless, but enough to let him demonstrate change through actions instead of promises, because words had lost their currency. I asked for consistency. Regular, brief check-ins that didn't veer into emotional territory until we were ready. No sudden appearances or gifts meant to buy goodwill. And he nodded, writing the points down on the small notepad Dr. Ellis provided like they were engineering specs he intended to follow precisely. Toward the end, when the hour was nearly up, Dr. Ellis asked if anyone wanted to try a small physical gesture of connection. Nothing forced, just an option. Perhaps holding hands or simply sitting closer. Mom surprised me by extending her hand toward Dad across the low coffee table. He hesitated, then took it gently, thumb brushing her knuckles once before letting go, and the sight of their joined hands, wrinkled now, rings still matching after all these years, brought a lump to my throat. That wasn't entirely grief. I didn't reach out, not yet, but I shifted on the couch so my knee almost touched his, close enough to feel the warmth without committing to contact, and that small movement felt enormous, like acknowledging that the space between us could narrow without disappearing altogether. We left separately, Mom first, then me, Dad last. So, no one had to navigate awkward goodbyes in the hallway, and in the elevator down, I stared at my reflection in the brushed steel doors, noticing how my shoulders had dropped a fraction, how the permanent tension line between my brows had softened just enough to notice. That night, Mark asked only one question: how was it? And I answered with the truth: exhausting, painful, but not hopeless. I didn't cry myself to sleep for the first time in weeks. Instead, I lay awake replaying the session, lingering on the moment Dad had looked at me and said the bike riding Dad still existed, and let myself believe, cautiously, that maybe he wasn't lying this time. Not because trust had returned, but because he'd finally stopped hiding the parts of himself that made honesty possible. The next morning, I found a text from him, simple and unadorned. Thank you for showing up yesterday. I'm going to keep showing up too. I didn't reply right away, but I didn't delete it either. I let it sit there on my phone like a small, tentative seed planted in ground that had been scorched but not entirely barren. And for the first time, I could imagine water reaching it someday. slow and careful, enough to coax something green from the ashes without pretending the fire had never happened. The idea for the family weekend started small, almost accidentally, during one of the later joint sessions, when Dr. Ellis asked what a low stakes reconnection might look like if we were willing to try one outside these beige walls. And Mom surprised everyone by saying she'd been thinking about the cabin upstate, the one Dad's parents had left him 20 years ago, a modest A frame on a quiet lake that we used to visit every August when I was little. Mosquito bites, samoas over the fire pit, Dad teaching me to skip stones until my arm ached, and the flat rocks finally danced across the water 3, 4, 5 times before sinking. No one had been there in over a decade. The place needed work, shutters loose, dock half rotted, but Mom said maybe fixing it together could be a way to test whether we could share space without the past crowding in too hard. And I felt my stomach drop at the suggestion because the cabin held so many untainted memories that bringing the current wreckage there felt like risking contamination. Yet something in her voice, quiet determination rather than forced optimism, made me pause before saying no outright, and Dad, after a long silence, agreed it was worth considering if everyone set clear rules. Separate bedrooms, no alcohol to blur boundaries, daily check ins about how people were feeling, and the explicit understanding that anyone could leave at any time without explanation or guilt. Lily was the deciding factor. She'd overheard Mom mentioning the lake during a phone call and begged to come, saying she hadn't been swimming since last summer at camp and Grandpa always promised to teach her how to fish properly, and refusing her felt crueler than risking the discomfort. So we planned for mid May, school letting out early that Friday, 4 days total, just the 4 of us Mom, Dad, Lily, and me. Mark staying home to give us room to navigate without an extra layer of audience. The drive up was tense at first. I rode with Mom in her SUV while Dad followed in his truck with Lily, who had insisted on riding with him because she wanted to play road trip games like spotting license plates from every state. And through the rearview mirror, I caught glimpses of her laughing at something he said, head thrown back, the sound carrying faintly when windows rolled down at stoplights. And it twisted something in me, jealousy that she could still access that easy joy with him, relief that she hadn't lost it entirely. We arrived just before dusk, the gravel crunching under tires, like shimmering flat and silver in the fading light, and the first task was practical, unloading groceries, airing out musty rooms. Dad immediately checking the water heater, while Mom and I wiped down counters sticky, with years of neglect, Lily darting between us asking if she could help. Her energy a buffer against the awkward silences that settled whenever Dad and I were in the same room too long. That first evening, we grilled burgers on the rusty barbecue. Dad cleaned with a wire brush for an hour, ate on the screened porch as the mosquitoes started their evening patrol, and conversation stayed surface level. Lily's upcoming science fair project on solar ovens, Mom's stories about funny patients at the hospital, Dad asking me careful questions about work, without pressing when my answers were short. After Lily went to bed in the loft, exhausted from running the length of the dock and back a dozen times, we 3 adults sat by the fire pit, flames low, because no one wanted the intensity of a roaring blaze. And Mom broke the quiet first by saying she'd brought the old photo albums from the attic, the ones we hadn't looked at since before, everything shattered, and asked if we could go through one together. Not to reminisce with rose-colored glasses, but to see what was still true amid what wasn't. I almost said no. The thought of seeing younger versions of us smiling felt like reopening a wound. But Dad spoke up softly. Only if it's okay with you. I don't want to pretend those moments didn't happen, just because I messed up later. We started with the earliest one, pages stiff, captions in Mom's neat handwriting. Me at 3, on Dad's shoulders, at the county fair. Cotton candy stuck in my hair. The 3 of us at the lake, the first summer we owned it. Dad, holding a stringer of sunfish like a trophy, while Mom pretended to be horrified by the smell. As we turned pages, the air grew thick with unsaid things, until we reached a photo from my high school graduation. Dad in his suit, arm around me, both of us grinning like the future was a straight line. And I felt tears prick without warning. I was so proud of you that day, he said, voice rough, and I still am. I just didn't know how to carry that pride without letting the other part leak in and ruin it. Mom reached over and touched his knee once, brief, then pulled back, and I managed to say, I believe you were proud. I just wish you trusted us enough to tell the truth instead of protecting us from it. The words hung there, not accusatory, exactly, more exhausted than angry. And he nodded, eyes on the fire. Then said the thing I hadn't realized I needed to hear. I was wrong. Protecting you by hiding made the hurt worse when it came out. I see that now, and I'm sorry. Not just for the secret, but for thinking I could control the damage by controlling what you knew. We didn't hug, didn't declare everything fixed, but the acknowledgement landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading without capsizing the boat. The next days unfolded in small, deliberate ways that stitched something back together. Dad and I rebuilt the dock together Saturday morning, passing tools without much talk, the rhythm of hammer and nails familiar from childhood projects, sweat mixing with lake water when we tested the new planks by jumping on them, Mom taught Lily how to make her famous pancakes, while Dad set up fishing rods on the shore. And later, we all sat on the end of the repaired dock, lines in the water, Lily squealing when she caught a tiny perch that Dad carefully unhooked and let her throw back, his hands gentle, the way they'd always been with living things. Sunday afternoon, a sudden rain drove us inside. We played board games at the scarred pine table, Monopoly first, then cards, laughing when Lily bankrupted everyone with hotels on Boardwalk. And during a lull, Dad looked at Mom across the table and said quietly, "I don't expect you to take me back. I just want you to know I'm doing the work to be someone worth trusting again, even if it's only from a distance." She didn't answer right away, just studied him, then reached for his hand under the table, held it for a full minute before letting go, and the gesture felt earned rather than performative. That night, after Lily was asleep and the rain drummed steady on the metal roof, I found Dad on the porch steps with a mug of tea, staring at the lake gone black under the clouds. I sat beside him, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, and after a while I said, "I'm not ready to call you Dad without the question still there, but I'm starting to see the man who fixed things, not just the one who broke them." He swallowed hard, set the mug down, and for the first time since everything unraveled, he reached out slowly, palm up, not demanding, but offering. I hesitated, then placed my hand in his, fingers curling lightly around his, the calluses still the same, the warmth familiar yet new, because it came without secrets between us. We sat like that until the rain eased, not speaking, just breathing the same damp air. And when I finally stood to go inside, he said only, "Thank you for giving me this weekend." And I answered, "Thank you for not ruining it." Monday morning, we packed up in companionable quiet, Lily chattering about when we could come back, Mom folding blankets with careful hands, Dad carrying coolers to the truck without being asked. The drive home felt lighter, not because everything was healed. Scars still ached when I thought too hard about Sarah and the other children, about the years I couldn't reclaim, but because we'd survived 4 days in close quarters without anyone walking away permanently, and that survival carried its own quiet power. When I hugged Lily goodbye in Mom's driveway, she whispered, "Grandpa smiled more this weekend than he has in forever." And I realized she was right. The smiles weren't forced, weren't guilty, just present. And seeing them felt like the first real evidence that forgiveness wasn't a single event, but a slow accumulation of moments where we chose, again and again, to stay in the same room, to hold space for both the hurt and the hope that maybe, just maybe, love could stretch far enough to cover the damage without breaking entirely. 1 year to the day after I stood in Dad's study holding that creased photo of a family I never knew existed, I found myself back at the cabin on the lake. Not because we planned a grand anniversary of survival, but because Lily had begged for one more weekend before summer ended, saying she wanted to beat her personal best for stone skipping and maybe finally catch a fish big enough to keep. And somehow, the four of us, Mom, Dad, Lily, and me, had agreed without the long negotiations that marked those first tentative months, the yes coming easier now, less like surrender, and more like habit. The drive up felt different this time. I rode shotgun in Dad's truck, while Mom and Lily followed in her car, windows down because the late August heat had finally broken into something bearable. Classic rock playing low on the radio. Songs Dad used to sing off key on family road trips. And when Brown Eyed Girl came on, he glanced over, caught my eye, and we both smiled the small, private smile of people who have walked through fire together and come out the other side singed but still standing. The cabin looked better than it had last May. Dad had come up alone a few times over the winter and spring to finish the dock repairs, replace the rotting porch boards, even paint the shutters, a soft gray Mom had chosen from paint swatches spread across the kitchen table one rainy Sunday when we were all there for coffee and nothing more dramatic than deciding on a color. Inside, the musty smell had faded, replaced by the faint scent of cedar from the new shelves he'd built for the books we kept leaving behind. And when we unpacked groceries, Lily immediately claimed the loft again, tossing her sleeping bag onto the mattress with the same dramatic flourish she'd used at 10. Now, 11, and growing into the kind of confidence that makes you marvel at how fast time moves when you're not watching. That first evening, we didn't rush to fill the silence with activity. Mom and I sat on the porch swing, while Dad and Lily walked down to the dock to set up fishing poles, their silhouettes against the sunset lake making a picture I didn't need to capture on my phone because it was already etching itself somewhere deeper. Over the year, the rhythm had settled into something sustainable. Weekly texts from Dad that started with mundane updates. New coffee blend he'd tried, a funny thing, a neighbor said, and gradually included questions about my life, my work, stress, whether Mark and I had decided on that trip to the coast we'd been talking about. I answered honestly, sometimes briefly, sometimes at length when the mood struck, and he never pushed for more than I offered. Mom had moved into her own apartment 6 months earlier, a bright one-bedroom near the hospital, with a balcony where she grew herbs in pots, telling me over takeout one night that she wasn't ready to divorce, Not yet. Maybe not ever, but she needed space that wasn't filled with his presence or his absence, and he'd respected that, paying half the rent without being asked, showing up only when invited. We'd had more joint sessions with Dr. Ellis until spring, then tapered to monthly check ins, then quarterly. The conversations shifting from damage control to maintenance, how to talk about holidays without pretending perfection, how to include Lily in ways that felt fair to everyone, how to acknowledge the other children without letting their existence become the defining fact of our family. Dad saw Jake and Mia regularly now, openly. He told us about their soccer games, their report cards, even sent photos when he asked first, and we said yes. And though the sight of those faces still carried a faint ache, it no longer felt like betrayal, but like accepting that his heart had stretched in ways I couldn't control. And my job wasn't to shrink it back, but to decide how much of it I still wanted touching mine. Forgiveness hadn't arrived in a single blinding moment. It came in increments so small they were almost invisible. A Christmas where we all sat around Mom's new dining table, and Lily asked Dad to carve the turkey the way he always used to, and he did without hesitation. Hands steady. A spring afternoon when Mom called him just to say the tulips he planted years ago were blooming again, and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing and everything. The day I texted him a photo of Mark and me at the farmer's market holding hands, captioned, "Still figuring it out," and he replied, "You're doing it better than I ever did. Tonight, Tonight, after burgers and corn on the cob grilled until the husks charred just right, after Lily caught a respectable base that Dad helped her release, because she decided it was too beautiful to eat. We built a fire on the beach, smaller than last year, more contained, and sat on blankets watching sparks rise into the clear dark. Lily curled against Mom's side, fighting sleep, asking questions about stars she'd learned in science class. And when she finally drifted off, Dad carried her inside, laid her gently in the loft, came back out with fresh mugs of hot chocolate, even though the night wasn't cold. He handed one to Mom first, then to me, our fingers brushing for a second longer than necessary, and when he sat down between us, "Not too close, not too far," he said quietly, "I don't know if I'll ever stop being sorry, but I'm grateful every day that you both still let me try to make it right." Mom looked at him over the rim of her mug, eyes soft in the firelight, and answered, "We're not keeping score anymore. We're just living the days we have left." I didn't add anything right away. I watched the lake reflect the flames, thought about the girl I'd been a year ago, shattered and furious in that study, and the woman I was now, scarred but no longer bleeding, able to sit here without bracing for the next blow. Eventually, I reached over, rested my hand on his forearm, felt the familiar warmth of skin and sinew and time, and said, "I love you. Not the same way I did before. I don't think that's possible, but different. Deeper, maybe, because I know what it cost to get here." He covered my hand with his, thumb tracing once across my knuckles, the way he used to, when I was small and scared of thunderstorms. And Mom leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, brief but deliberate, before straightening again. We stayed like that until the fire burned to embers, talking in low voices about ordinary things, the new roof, the cabin would need next year, whether Lily should try out for the middle school soccer team, how Mark's promotion might mean we could finally afford that bigger place we'd been eyeing. And underneath the everyday words ran a current of something hard won. Trust. Fragile. Still. Patched in places, but no longer in imminent danger of collapse. Love that had bent almost to breaking, and somehow held. A family bond that looked different now. Less seamless, more honest, less seamless, more honest, marked by the fault lines, but stronger for knowing exactly where they lay. When we finally went inside, the screen door creaking softly behind us, I paused on the porch to look back at the lake. One last time, stars scattered across its surface like spilled diamonds, and felt the quiet certainty that we weren't finished healing. We might never be, but we were no longer defined by the wound. We were defined by the choice. We are levied, made again each day, to keep showing up, to keep holding space for both the hurt and the hope. And in that scarred, steady persistence, there was a kind of grace I hadn't known existed until we had to earn it the hard way.